In one of the hotels, a young couple takes pills of a new popular substance. After the guy leaves, the woman sees a weird bush beginning to grow in the corner of the apartment. Surprisingly, instead of the walls of the elevator, the guy sees the landscape in front of him. At this time, the woman finds herself in a forest. An ancient man stands in front of her, and a huge snake crawls under her feet. Two paramedic partners, Steve and Dennis, receive a call from a weird woman. She explains that she was sleeping, and then heard a conversation in French, and then the howling of the wind. When she finally woke up, she saw that her friends were lying on the floor. Steve realizes that she has clearly overdosed. While walking around, the man accidentally stabs his hand with a syringe and is frightened by possible infection. Another victim received a penetrating hit with something similar to a sword. Steve finds a deformed ancient coin under the body of the victim. Steve looks at the coin and remembers how he took tests to check his blood after being stabbed with a syringe. The nurse calmed him down and promised to do a full body examination. The next day, Dennis invites Steve to a picnic for his youngest daughter's birthday. The man notices Brianna sitting on a large rock and goes to greet her. The stone has been standing here for a long time, and someone has carved a word always on it. The next day, they receive a call to a burned man, which in reality turns out to be a completely burned corpse. The guys are unhappy. They have absolutely nothing to do here. But nevertheless, they are interested in what happened, because cases of spontaneous combustion are very rare. At the scene of the tragedy, the police find a burned door handle and packaging of a substance called synchronic. Steve undergoes a full examination in the laboratory and receives confirmation that he is developing a brain tumor. Days go by, and the next call again surprises the paramedics. This time, a snake bit someone in an ordinary hotel room. The police searched everything around, but did not find anything, and the bites look very strange. There are definitely no such reptiles in this area. In addition, the guy with whom the girl moved into this room disappeared. Dennis examines the elevator and finds the guy's body. After some time, the doctor explains to Steve that his case is unique. The pineal gland of adults usually hardens, but his organ looks like a teenager's. It looks like his tumor appeared a long time ago, and even if he undergoes chemotherapy, he has little time left. Meanwhile, Brianna announces her decision to move to campus. Steve tries to figure out how to tell Dennis about his illness. The men meet in the evening on the occasion of Steve's birthday, but while talking about life, Steve doesn't dare to say anything. Dennis notices that his friend has some pills. The next day, the partners receive a call to a student campus and discover a group of teenagers who have taken illegal substances. While helping teenagers, Dennis suddenly hears his daughter's name. It turns out that Brianna was here, but then suddenly disappeared somewhere. Steve notices a package of synchronic lying next to the chair on which the girl was sitting. While Dennis informs his wife about the disappearance of his daughter, Steve goes to a smoking goods store and buys the remaining synchronic pills. The saleswoman informs him that these are the last ones since the substance has been discontinued. Steve lashes out at her, blaming the dealer for the deaths of a bunch of people. A young man catches up with Steve on the street and asks to sell him synchronic at a very decent price, but Steve refuses. Meanwhile, Dennis begins a search for his daughter, but no one has seen the girl and does not know what happened to her. At night, Steve hears suspicious sounds and discovers the guy from the street in his apartment, who turns out to be the chemist Dr. Kermani, who created the synchronic. He says that he wanted to create a harmless product that would relax the body without causing much harm. But it turned out that the substance allows the user to travel back in time. He explains to Steve that all times are like tracks on a vinyl record. Everything is here and now at the same time, and only a needle can revive the right time. So the synchronic seems to break through time, carrying away the one who used it at a certain moment. Adults usually die, but children and teenagers can remain in another time forever, because their pineal gland has not yet hardened, and due to the fact that several children have already disappeared. The chemist himself is looking for the remaining doses to destroy synchronic. Kermani wants to make sure that the paramedic will destroy the pills, but Steve kicks the scientist out. Later, he begins to undergo chemotherapy. Dennis notices his friend's strange behavior and begins to suspect him of stealing substances from their medicine cabinet. Another call brings friends to a weird guy who has broken his leg. While working, Dennis accuses Steve of coming to work while being high and begins to teach his friend about life. Steve reproaches his friend for constant whining and disregard for his family. It comes to a fight, after which Steve leaves. At home, he hears news about the search for Brianna and takes the synchronic pills out of the trash can. After taking one, he suddenly sees how the walls of the apartment start to melt, after which he finds himself in a swamp. He touches the trees and even smells the flowers, trying to figure out if this is real. But suddenly, he sees a crocodile preparing to attack, while on the other side, an armed conquistador appears. The guy barely manages to dodge the sword and ends up at home. Having come to his senses, Steve understands that the scientist's story is true and begins to experiment with tablets, recording everything on camera. He decides to find Dennis's daughter, who clearly went back in time. The next pill transports Steve to a snowy plain where he almost freezes to death. After coming back home, he concludes that he goes back in time for 7 minutes, and from different places of departure, you fall into different times. The next time, he puts on warm clothes and takes firewood with him. He ends up in the same place as the last time, after which he makes a fire and watches in surprise at the mammoth passing by. Then a human of this time appears in front of him and swings a spear at the guy, but Steve manages to show his peacefulness and the prehistoric man sits down by his fire. When Steve returns, he concludes that he can return to the present only by coming to the same place where he started time travel. The question arises as to why Brianna is stuck in the past. Meanwhile, the disappearance of the daughter causes a crisis in Dennis's family life. He constantly reminisces about the good times while his wife refuses to communicate with him. Steve has the last 5 synchronic tablets left and is preparing to conduct one last experiment. He wants to find out whether it is possible to take something living with him from the past. Steve decides to take his dog with him. Having taken the pill, Steve finds himself in the beginning of the 20th century. A resident of the house calls the police and lashes out at him. Steve and the dog are running down the street and their appearance causes a stir among the locals. Steve manages to break away from his pursuers and even sneak back into the house, where he meets the owner again. The man lashes out at Steve, who releases his dog, and at that moment, the time travel begins. The guy returns to his apartment, but the dog remains in the past. Steve gets another conclusion: you cannot be late to the departure point, and that if you hold something tightly in your hands, it will end up with you in the past, or vice versa, it will move from the past to the present. Meanwhile, Dennis is trying to reach his wife and recalls about Steve's tragedy. During Hurricane Katrina, the coffins of his parents and sister were washed out of the ground and ended up in the middle of the city. After seeing corpses, Dennis fainted and Steve brought him to his senses. He was primarily worried about Dennis, although the tragedy happened to himself. Meanwhile, Steve takes a synchronic in the house where Brianna disappeared and finds himself in the night forest where members of a religious cult attack him. He rips the amulet off the neck of the main saucer and runs to the place of arrival. He barely manages to return home. Brianna's friend tells him that the girl went somewhere the night she disappeared. After everything that happened, Dennis and Steve meet in a bar. Dennis admits that his marriage is over because Brianna is gone, and his wife hates him, although he constantly thinks about her and misses his daughter a lot. Then Steve informs him about his illness. He takes Dennis to the family graves and shows him a recording of his experiments. Dennis is excited by this discovery. He says that if he was in the same situation as his daughter, he would leave an inscription on something eternal. This prompts Steve to have certain thoughts, after which they go to the boulder on which Brianna loved to sit. While Dennis talks about his vision of life and death, Steve takes a pill and finds himself in the middle of a battle. The man tries to hide in the trenches, but they are overflowing with bodies. Steve starts calling Brianna, and suddenly the girl answers. She does not understand how he found her. Steve reminds her of the message on the boulder, but it turns out that she didn't write anything. Steve gives her the last pill and leads her to the boulder, but at the very stone, they are stopped by a soldier who calls Steve his slave and threatens him with a weapon. Steve tries to talk to him, but he is very aggressive. Brianna sits on a boulder when Steve notices an unexploded mine sticking out under the soldier's feet and hopes that he will step on it. In the end, this happens, but when Steve turns to the stone, he does not see the girl. Brianna returned to her time and met with father. Steve realizes that he did not have time to return and sits down on a stone. His flickering image appears in front of his friends, and Dennis shakes Steve's hand, which flickers and eventually dissolves in time. He was the one who left the word always on the stone.